Introduction: The Nightmare That Haunted 1970s America. Hello, and welcome. Today let's take a journey back in time, a journey into the dark and unsettling heart of America during the 1970s. For many, the 1970s conjure images of bell-bottom jeans, disco fever, and the optimism of a generation chasing the American dream. But beneath that surface of vibrant pop culture and economic ambitions, there lurked a shadow stretching from coast to coast. A shadow cast by economic decline, social upheaval, and a growing sense of public vulnerability. The Midwest, often known as America's heartland, became ground zero for a chilling series of crimes that would leave an entire region paralyzed with fear. In communities built on the backbone of manufacturing and family values, the calm was shattered by news that women, ordinary mothers, daughters, students, were being stalked, attacked, and in some cases brutally murdered by an invisible predator. As factory jobs disappeared and cities like Detroit, Cleveland, and Chicago struggled with waves of layoffs, a new fear began creeping through the neighborhoods. If you were a woman alone at night, it didn't matter if you were downtown or in the quiet suburbs. No place felt safe. Headlines screamed from the front pages of newspapers and echoed through living rooms via the evening news. Neighborhood watch groups sprang up overnight. Sales of locks, alarm systems, and even firearms spiked. Self-defense classes flourished, and parents who once sent their daughters out on errands with little concern, now drove them door to door, scanning the shadows. The air was thick with suspicion. People stared at their neighbors a little longer. Men with unknown vehicles passing through town drew outright hostility, and rumors ran wild at barbershops and diners alike. It wasn't just the violence itself that unsettled the public, but the chilling randomness and brutality of it. The victims weren't famous, powerful, or connected. They were regular women, leading normal lives, whose only mistake was being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Authorities, already stretched thin by rising crime in the post-industrial Midwest, were baffled. The Midwestern Ripper, as the papers eventually dubbed him, seemed to vanish into thin air after each attack. He could be anyone: a truck driver stopping for coffee at a rest stop, a mechanic fueling up at midnight, or the man next door who always remembered to rake his leaves. For women in particular, every nightfall was tainted by dread. Walking alone, waiting for the bus, or simply jogging in the park became acts of courage. Like a dark legend, stories of close calls and odd encounters multiplied. For a time, the city streets emptied out after dusk, and the pulse of the Midwest itself seemed to skip a beat, paralyzed by anxiety, uncertainty, and an ever-present question: when and where would the monster strike again? Thus began one of the most terrifying and enduring chapters in American criminal history. Our journey brings us to this precise backdrop: a country searching for answers, a region pushed to the brink of panic, and a killer whose shadow would haunt the nation for years to come. As we dive deeper into this chilling case, remember, this isn't just a story about one murderer. It is a window into a whole era's fears, faults, and fight for justice. The first victim, and scattered clues. It was a night that should have been utterly unremarkable for Anna Rogers, a 36-year-old single mother who worked long hours at a local diner in Springfield, Illinois. On May 3, 1975, the air hung cool and damp as twilight settled over the quiet, working-class neighborhood she called home. Anna had just finished another late shift, her feet aching, her mind already drifting to thoughts of her sleeping son. She took a shortcut down Franklin Avenue, a street she'd walked 100 times before, never imagining that fate would turn this familiar path into a corridor of terror. As Anna approached a patch of flickering streetlights, her senses pricked with a sudden awareness that she was not alone. Before she could cry out or reach for her purse, a figure lunged out from behind a parked car. Everything after that was a blur. A crushing blow to her head sent her crashing to the sidewalk, her scream muffled by a gloved hand. The attacker worked quickly and mercilessly. In the dim light, Anna barely registered the flash of a blade before excruciating pain radiated from her abdomen. She was certain in that terrible moment that she would not live to see another sunrise. Yet destiny, or perhaps sheer luck, intervened. Mr. O'Malley, who lived 2 doors down, heard a scuffle and the frantic gurgled cry for help. He rushed outside, joined by his teenage son, flashlight in hand. As they approached, the attacker melted into the shadows, vanishing between houses and leaving Anna bleeding and motionless on the sidewalk. Paramedics arrived within minutes, stabilized her, and raced her to the nearest ER. Surgeons fought for hours to repair the internal damage. Against all odds, Anna survived, but survival was just the beginning. The horrors of the attack followed Anna home from the hospital, seeping into every quiet moment of her life. She could no longer walk her neighborhood after dark. The once comforting hush of night now throbbed with peril. Her mind replayed the attack on a loop, footsteps behind her, the glint of steel, the smell of leather gloves, a waking nightmare that made even the simple act of stepping outside a test of courage. The police, struggling with spikes in crime and limited by technology of the time, canvassed the area. They found precious little, no fingerprints, no definitive footprints, and no weapon left behind. Anna, still shaken and medicated, could only recall that her assailant was a man of average build, wearing dark clothes and gloves, his face shrouded by a cap pulled low. She remembered nothing distinctive about his voice, only that he struck her down almost silently, with an efficiency that suggested premeditation rather than impulse. Investigators interviewed neighbors, logged witness statements, and scoured for connections to other attacks. But nothing fit. To seasoned detectives, the case felt like a stone thrown into a bottomless well. There were ripples and rumors, but nothing concrete. Anna's attack was reported on local news channels as a cautionary tale, sparking concern but not yet panic. The police warned citizens to stay vigilant, especially women working late shifts, but assured them that extra patrols would continue. Beneath those assurances, however, anxiety simmered. Anna's case did not vanish into obscurity. It festered, a reminder that unnatural violence could erupt even in small-town America. For Springfield and its surrounding neighborhoods, the question loomed: was this a random act, or the first warning shot from a predator lurking in plain sight? It would take only a few weeks for the answer to become terrifyingly clear. Anna Rogers' survival left behind not just scars but also the first faint traces of a mystery that would soon consume the entire region. The clues, scattered and incomplete, waited in silence, biding their time until the next victim fell. The wave of attacks spreads. In the weeks that followed Anna Rogers' harrowing ordeal, Springfield and surrounding areas in central Illinois began to experience a chilling and unprecedented escalation. What many hoped, and authorities tried to assure, was a one-off nightmare soon revealed itself as the opening act in a dark serial tragedy. The attacker was not finished. He was only just beginning. Late in June 1975, only a few miles south of Springfield in the neighboring town of Decatur, residents awoke to troubling news. Olga Small, a 46-year-old librarian, had been assaulted in an alley behind the local public library. Just like Anna, Olga had decided to take a shortcut on her way home after closing up for the night. She never made it to her doorstep. Instead, she was ambushed from behind, thrown to the ground, and, echoing the pattern of the earlier assault, slashed viciously across the abdomen by an unseen assailant. Miraculously, Olga survived. Though gravely injured, she was able to recount a chilling detail to police. Her attacker had muttered threats in a flat, unmistakable Midwestern accent. He sounded like a local, someone who could blend seamlessly into the very community he now terrorized. No longer could the authorities write the violence off as random or unconnected. The attacks bore all the hallmarks of planning, ritual, and most terrifying of all, repeat intent. Word spread quickly through Decatur, connecting the fate of Olga Small to Anna Rogers across county lines. The collective realization settled in. A pattern was unfolding, one that defied rationale or reason, one that pointed to a predator who was free to strike again. This suspicion was horrifically validated within days in the river city of Quincy, where 14-year-old Jamie Brown fell victim while returning home after a summer evening at a friend's house. Jamie never saw her attacker approaching under the lengthening shadows of dusk. The man, described by Jamie in her terrified, fragmented statement as having dark hair, a scruffy beard, and really deep eyes, matched a description eerily similar to the previous suspects. He moved wordlessly and with a calculated speed, bludgeoning her with a hammer he'd hidden inside his jacket. As Jamie drifted into unconsciousness from the blow to her head and pain from a knife wound, fate intervened in the form of a passing pickup whose headlights swept the alley. Startled, her assailant vaulted a fence and fled into the night, leaving her crumpled in the grass. Rescued by the driver, who failed to see Jamie at first but soon doubled back, the teen survived, shaken, but alive. Her testimony provided a composite sketch and the now repetitive pattern of the attacker, opportunistic but organized, stalking victims on lonely streets or alleys, using overwhelming force and a signature knife wound. He spoke in a nondescript Midwest accent, blending Hollywood villainy with Midwestern banality, a terrifying combination that made him nearly invisible. Within a month, another attack occurred, this time in Champaign. Each time the evidence was sparse, each time the witness descriptions had the same uncanny hallmarks, and each time the sense of safety in town after town was eroded further. Women walked in groups, parents refused to let children play outdoors past sunset. Men eyed strangers with a mixture of suspicion and dread, wary that any outsider, or even a lifelong neighbor, could secretly be a monster on the prowl. Newspaper headlines grew bolder. Illinois stalked by serial slasher. Terror strikes again in small town. Parents demand action. The police response began to shift from quiet reassurance to open alarm. Task forces were assembled. State troopers and FBI agents started appearing in local precincts. Press conferences were called. Grainy sketches posted in grocery stores and on telephone poles. But the attacker, dubbed the Midwestern Ripper by Chicago's largest newspaper, continued to evade capture, refusing to answer the mounting public outcry for justice. The true horror lay not only in the violence itself, but in the growing, paralyzing realization that anyone could be next, that the police, for all their bluster, were as much in the dark as the citizens they pledged to protect. As the summer of 1975 deepened, the once tranquil heartland of America had become the hunting ground for a predator whose identity, motives, and next move were equally opaque. The wave of attacks was not just growing in number, it was swallowing communities in a tide of fear that showed no sign of receding. Young victims, fear spares no one. Before June was over, the unthinkable happened, proof that the violence haunting Illinois had no boundaries, that no walk of life was off limits. While many adults had already begun glancing over their shoulders, making calculated choices about when and where to go out after dark, parents still wanted to believe, that the real danger would not threaten children. That illusion was shattered on a humid Thursday evening in the small river town of Quincy. Jamie Brown was 14, a straight-A student with a love for art and a reputation for never missing her curfew. Her parents trusted her with a 9 p.m. return because their town had always been safe. On the night of the attack, she stayed a little late at her best friend's house on the other side of the rail tracks, just a mile's walk home down Elm Street, under a canopy of aged sycamore trees and lazy summer insects. She said goodbye, promising to text when she got in, and started that familiar walk at 8:45. It was still light enough to see her breath as she talked aimlessly to herself, humming a tune from the radio. Jamie almost reached the corner grocery when the world changed. Only a block from home she noticed a tall man across the street pacing her every step. She instinctively sped up, feeling her heart flutter, a familiar fear, unfamiliar in strength. The man closed the distance with barely a sound. What Jamie remembered was sudden, a blur of motion, the glint of metal, the impact of a hammer on her scalp sending a wave of electric white pain, terror as she was dragged behind a bush, then slashed across her stomach as he hissed, "Don't scream!" In those seconds, if they were only seconds, her world was reduced to fear, pain, and the burning smell of the attacker's leather gloves. The last thing Jamie saw before blacking out was a pair of bright headlights arcing down the street. Miraculously, those headlights belonged to a delivery driver ending his shift. The man's presence startled her attacker, sending him over a backyard fence and vanishing into the June night. Jamie's survival was sheer luck, and her own unwillingness to die. Even in the hazy twilight between consciousness and shock, she managed to crawl to the nearest porch where an elderly woman found her and called 911. Jamie's injuries would send her to surgery, leave her with a long scar and a concussion, but the emotional damage cut deeper than any knife. For weeks, she was haunted by nightmares, seeing a man's shadow beneath her window, reliving the predatory calm in those dark eyes. She refused to walk alone, forced her parents to leave the hallway light on, and broke down crying when a teacher startled her by calling her name in class. The news rocked Quincy and radiated outward. If a 14-year-old girl could be stalked and nearly slaughtered while walking home before 9 at night, then nobody, absolutely nobody, was safe. PTA meetings turned frantic. School resource officers were posted at every entrance. Sports programs and after-school activities saw enrollment drop by half overnight. Classmates whispered nervously in the halls, avoiding shortcuts and clutching pepper spray or house keys between their knuckles like makeshift weapons. Police finally had a survivor young enough and frightened enough to recall details. Jamie described her attacker with a chilling clarity. Dark hair, a heavy uneven beard, cold, deep-set eyes, a vague accent that could have come from anywhere in Illinois. She remembered how he repeatedly dropped back a step behind her, muttering about feeling sick, clearly a calculated ruse to lull her into complacency before the attack. This incident, and Jamie's courage in reliving it with investigators, would prove critical. The composite sketch she helped create looked eerily like sketches from earlier cases. Detectives made clear to the public, they were hunting one man, a man whose rules shifted on a whim, who attacked the vulnerable, no matter their age. As panic mounted, some communities introduced curfews. Teenage girls formed groups and scheduled rides. Parents installed floodlights and in some cases bought dogs. Fear was not contained by fences or familiarity. The attack on Jamie Brown proved once and for all that the Midwest's monster had broken through every social barrier, that random violence truly could strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. The Midwestern Ripper had not merely entered their towns, he had invaded their childhoods, rupturing a sense of safety that would never quite return. The spread of dread, fear, infects the heartland. By midsummer of 1975, the collective mood across the Midwest had shifted from anxiety to all-consuming dread. What began as whispered schoolyard rumors and late-night news bulletins had now metastasized into a daily drumbeat of fear, echoing across kitchen tables, factory floors, and church pews. Even in broad daylight, townsfolk watched over their shoulders, sensing a threat that seemed to seep into every crack of daily life. Local journalists and big-city news outlets alike burned through headlines. Stories about the attacks filled newspapers from Chicago to St. Louis. Regional TV stations led with updates every night, showing somber-faced anchors reciting the latest details or lack thereof. Police sketches and pleas for the community to stay vigilant became routine interruptions on radio waves and community boards. The monster stalking Illinois was no longer just a local nightmare, it was a regional crisis, and everyone felt its cold grip. Women in Blue Island, Peoria, and small farming towns in between changed their routines overnight. Jogging routes were abandoned, night shifts swapped for daytime work, and group walks home from high school became a new norm. Stores reported surges in sales of deadbolts, mace, and even handguns. Hardware shops struggled to keep security tools in stock. Self-defense classes and neighborhood watch sign-ups reached record numbers. Men organized impromptu night patrols, driving the grid of their blocks with flashlights and old baseball bats, hoping to spot something, anything, that could end the reign of terror. The mounting pressure on law enforcement was relentless. Police chiefs gave tense press conferences promising to catch the culprit, while rank-and-file officers doggedly responded to every strange noise or unfamiliar car. Hundreds of tips and supposed sightings poured in, most dissolving into nothing, but the sense that the community was under siege only deepened. Behind the scenes, detectives juggled not just a baffling case but also a tidal wave of fear-fueled rumors, false alarms about prowlers, imagined footprints in the backyard, a curse whispered about dark alleyways that people now hurried past. Children and teenagers, forbidden to roam after dusk, grew resentful and restless. Parents bore the invisible burden of knowing that no amount of caution could guarantee their loved ones' safety. Facebook didn't exist, but word of mouth and the phone tree spread warnings and conspiracy theories with lightning speed. At Sunday services and PTA meetings, prayers for protection mingled with collective outrage. How could this happen here? Why hadn't the police stopped him? What if next time it was my daughter? As the summer faded, the Midwestern Ripper was now more than just a criminal. He was a ghost story come to life, a force that turned strong communities into islands of suspicion. In every darkened window or unfamiliar step on the porch, people saw menace. The shadow cast was larger than one man or his crimes. It was a darkness that would take years for the Midwest to shake. The tragic climax. By the time autumn settled over Illinois in 1975, fear had metastasized into something deeper and far more corrosive: hopelessness. Residents who once believed the storm would eventually pass, now whispered that their towns might never be the same, even if the killer was caught. It was in this atmosphere of frayed nerves and sleepless nights that the case reached its ghastly turning point in Peoria, a once busy hub now haunted by empty streets after sundown. Gina Miller's story would come to define that turning point. At just 28, she was already a survivor, mother to 4 young children, working 2 jobs to make ends meet after her husband's factory layoff. Gina's life was a patchwork of sacrifice and hope, the kind of daily struggle that once represented the backbone of the American Midwest. Her days began before dawn, lunch breaks spent folding laundry, evenings cleaning a small office building after her shift at a local diner. She was known to everyone on her block as a tireless spirit, always quick to wave to the crossing guard or shovel her neighbor's walk. But on a rain-soaked October night, Gina became the Ripper's most heartbreaking victim. Walking home along a shortcut through the alley behind her apartment building, she was ambushed in almost textbook fashion, struck at the base of her skull with what investigators would later determine was a ball-peen hammer, then dragged out of the muddy light of a security lamp. The brutality was shocking even to hardened detectives. Her abdomen was slashed deeply, her lifeless body left in a patch of weeds where, for reasons no one could fathom, her purse and groceries were arranged carefully beside her. The news exploded across the state. One more terror attack, yes, but this time the community's grief was tinged with something closer to fury than despair. Gina's funeral packed the local church with mourners. Men who'd never owned a firearm lined up to purchase shotguns, and women demanded the city double patrol units. For the first time, Peoria's mayor declared a state of emergency. Children were no longer just urged but strictly forbidden to go anywhere alone. The tragedy marked a shift from anxious watchfulness to outright crisis. Gina's murder also marked a subtle but important shift in the police investigation. Reporters began pressing more openly for details, frustrated by the lack of any substantial leads. Tireless volunteers combed the area for clues, and state authorities reorganized their task force in response to accusations of negligence and incompetence. Yet despite this mobilization, the killer remained a phantom, his methods chillingly consistent but his identity hidden behind the fog of rumor and fear. As the leaves turned and mourners visited Gina's grave, it was clear the community had reached its psychological breaking point. The shadow cast over Illinois was no longer the abstract threat of some monster out there. It had a face, a victim, and a level of brutality that made denial impossible. The tragedy of Gina Miller wasn't just one more name in a long list. It was a line crossed, a night after which nothing in central Illinois would feel safe or innocent again. Critical turning points in the investigation. The winter of 1976 brought with it a bitter chill, both in the weather and the ongoing investigation. Frustration was mounting, and the public's patience had begun to fray. Nights were colder and darker than ever, but detectives on the case refused to let the trail go cold. It was during this bleak period that the investigation took its first significant turn, one that finally offered a glimmer of hope to communities desperate for answers. The catalyst was the brutal murder of Emily Jackson, a 42-year-old factory worker. Emily was attacked after a late shift while she crossed a deserted lot just a few blocks from her modest home. The crime scene this time was especially gruesome. Emily was found with over 50 stab wounds, her features nearly unrecognizable. The excessive violence stunned even veteran officers, and the sense of urgency became palpable. What distinguished this scene from the others, however, was a rare piece of physical evidence. For the first time, officers found a single bloody footprint partially preserved in the icy mud. While primitive by today's standards, 1976 forensics considered this substantial. The shoe print's pattern and size would be logged and compared against anyone brought in for questioning moving forward. Not long after, the investigation's trajectory shifted again when another victim managed to survive. Marcella Collins, a pregnant newlywed, was ambushed outside an all-night laundromat but managed to fight off her attacker. Though badly wounded and traumatized, Marcella recounted key details through tears at her hospital bedside. Blinking back panic, she whispered to detectives that her assailant had a distinctive odor of diesel fuel, strong and unmistakable, clinging to his clothing and skin. More importantly, the man had threatened her by name and referenced her routine. Piecing this together, the task force theorized that the killer had been surveilling his targets closely, perhaps with the mobility to cross county lines undetected. Marcella also recalled a flash of a metallic badge, a sticker or emblem, on what she described as a large idling semi-truck. The revelation electrified investigators. Was the killer a truck driver using his routes to mask patterns and move unseen across Illinois? The scope of the investigation widened dramatically. Troopers coordinated with highway patrols and way stations, and the search began for any trucker matching witness-provided composites or shoeprint data. These promising developments reinvigorated the investigation and shifted its focus to a new demographic. Law enforcement increased surveillance at roadside diners, motels, and truck stops across the state. Flyers were distributed, sketches and physical evidence were scrutinized anew, and the task force pressed for tips from anyone who might have noticed a suspicious trucker with erratic hours or a tendency to linger in local neighborhoods. Pressure from the media and the public led to a surge in reports, some false and some promising, but all feeding into a growing database of possible suspects. Several other procedural milestones emerged thanks to the renewed sense of urgency. For the first time, a pooled, multi-jurisdictional task force was formed, combining talent from Springfield, Decatur, and state-level investigators, along with new input from the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit. This marked a critical evolution in the investigation. No longer siloed or bound by county rivalries, the manhunt became more organized and coordinated. Regular meetings were convened where detectives compared notes on wounds, attack timing, and geographic trends, slowly assembling a psychological profile. The assessment grew more sophisticated. The killer likely stayed mobile, changed his appearance, and might possess mechanical skills consistent with trucking or auto repair work. Technological breakthroughs were modest but meaningful. Forensic examiners began using more consistent methods of preserving partial prints and fiber evidence. Lab work on the muddy footprint from Emily Jackson's scene identified a rare type of work boot, narrowed to brands favored by long-haul truckers and mechanics. Police hoped this would help flag suspects during traffic stops or background checks. Meanwhile, barely legible fingerprints lifted from a torn handbag at one scene were being cataloged on the off chance a future arrest would provide a match. Despite these leaps forward, each victory arrived with fresh frustration. The surge in tips overwhelmed the system, and promising leads often fizzled out or worse, led to questioning and traumatizing innocent people. Angry communities demanded faster results while authorities pleaded with citizens for patience and vigilance. And for all the new evidence, the elusive truck-driving suspect remained at large. But there was no going back. Thanks to Emily Jackson's gruesome scene, Marcella Collins's bravery, and the dogged determination of a tireless multi-agency task force, the investigation had finally begun to sharpen its focus. Suspicion flowed along America's highways and into truck stops, promising that the killer's freedom was narrowing mile by mile, season by season. The tragic curve and false clues. With the case dragging into its third year, hope that the killer's trail would finally be pinned down had all but faded into exhaustion and suspicion. The mounting number of victims and the increasingly public scrutiny only added to the pressure weighing on every detective working the case. What haunted everyone involved was the sense that the investigation was moving in circles, swamped not just by a scarcity of real evidence, but by a tidal wave of misleading tips, red herrings, and tragic false starts that would cost the community dearly. One of the most frustrating chapters in the investigation began with a seemingly solid tip. Several witnesses in Peoria, right after the murder of Gina Miller, noticed a large semi-truck idling outside the victim's apartment complex. The truck, a Peterbilt by all their accounts, was described as battered, with a torn mud flap and a custom chrome exhaust. Theories swirled. Did the killer use trucking routes as cover for his crimes? Could he vanish from scene to scene by simply driving on to the next remote stop, blending in with thousands of other long haulers crisscrossing the Midwest? Detectives wasted no time. They scrambled together a multi-jurisdictional search, working with highway patrol units, state troopers, and even reaching out to the Department of Transportation for logs of every Peterbilt registered in Illinois and bordering states. Checkpoints sprang up at way stations. Truckers found themselves woken in the dead of night or held at rest areas for questioning. Mechanics in truck stops were questioned about regulars with Peterbilts. Toll booth cameras were scrutinized for a glimpse of that battered rig. It was a show of investigative force meant to rattle the culprit, but it began to strain public goodwill and resources. Yet, after weeks of exhaustive effort, thousands of trucks checked, hundreds of drivers interviewed, nothing concrete emerged. Video footage was always grainy, license plates hard to match, and alibis often unshakable. The supposed Peterbilt, the focal point of so much hope, yielded no suspect. Whispers in the force grew cynical. Maybe the tip had been a product of the public's paranoia, or just an innocent driver in the wrong place at the wrong time. The task force was left, yet again, empty-handed. As summer turned to fall in 1977, the pressure to achieve a breakthrough twisted into desperation. A minor miracle, or so it seemed, appeared in the form of physical evidence overlooked at a previous scene. A $5 bill, found wedged beneath a dumpster behind a vandalized laundromat, bearing a rare serial number. It was crisp, almost new, clearly out of place in the trash-littered gloom. A rookie officer suggested tracing the bill's origin, theorizing that it could be payroll money from a company in the area, possibly paid to an employee recently present at the scene. Excitement blossomed quietly within the department. Maybe this was the forensic break they'd been praying for. The investigation into the $5 bill became a Herculean effort unto itself. Local banks combed records for recent cash withdrawals matching the serial, while detectives compiled lists of companies that had payroll payouts in small bills. Clerks at fast food restaurants and convenience stores were quietly shown the bill for possible memory jogs. For weeks, a sense of momentum returned to the team, but this too proved a dead end. The serial number was eventually traced, painstakingly, to a plant in Bloomington that paid hundreds of workers each week. Receipts and ledgers were a mess. Tracking which employee had received the particular $5 and whether it had genuinely belonged to the killer was next to impossible. After months of effort, the promising clue dissolved into just another spent lead. Meanwhile, reports began to pour in from across the region of suspicious characters, odd vehicles, and near misses. Each call was different: a bearded man loitering by a playground in Mattoon, a stranger in a pickup offering rides to a waitress in Urbana, a phantom who slipped out a bar's back door just as the police arrived. Some tips were earnest but confused, others the product of genuine terror. Many were pure invention, stoked by the fever dream of a community on edge. Time after time, investigators wasted precious hours chasing men with the wrong build, vehicles with the wrong color, stories that unraveled under the slightest scrutiny. Hindering matters further were a series of media leaks and unfounded rumors. News outlets desperate for headlines sensationalized every minor arrest or police search, making it harder to separate true developments from the noise. One week, a fire in a farmer's field would be breathlessly reported as a possible dumping ground for the killer. Another, a local drunk's ramblings would trigger a full-scale search of a riverbank. With every false alarm, public confidence in law enforcement continued to erode. For detectives, each disappointment weighed heavier, the pressure to deliver justice twisting into fatigue and self-doubt. There were even moments when suspicion fell on the wrong people entirely. Most tragically, a janitor at a roadside motel who, due to his quiet demeanor and night shift schedule, became the target of both a smear campaign and official scrutiny. After days of questioning, his ironclad alibi cleared him, but the damage lingered. Lost employment, broken friendships, uneasy stares from neighbors. His ordeal only reinforced just how destructive and distracting the hunt for red herrings had become. Through all of this, real leads remained painfully elusive. Some detectives began to wonder aloud whether the killer enjoyed the carnage outside his direct violence. Watching the police scramble, the public accuse the innocent, and faith in civil order collapse bit by bit. Others, hardened by disappointment, fell into grim routines, cataloging each tip with weary skepticism, reminding themselves not to let hope for a breakthrough become wishful thinking. By late 1977, the case file for the Midwestern Ripper had grown to several overflowing cabinets of paperwork, photographs, maps studded with pins, and a chaos of typed and handwritten interviews. An entire faculty of law enforcement was being held hostage by the killer's shadow, outmaneuvered at every turn by his unpredictability, and protected, in a sense, by the fog of bad information. The tragic irony was inescapable. The harder the community and its protectors groped for clarity, the more tangled and opaque the investigation grew. Still, if there was a lesson written in the wasted effort and emotional toll of these missteps, it was this: evil, especially when cunning and unmoored, has a way of warping its entire environment, turning neighbors and strangers alike into accidental accomplices or suspects. By the end of this dismal chapter, the people of Illinois and the detectives hunting their most prolific serial predator had learned a hard truth. They were fighting not only for justice but for the very soul of their community, and that sometimes on the road to answers, the greatest enemies are the mistakes and mirages encountered along the way. The lingering trauma and grave errors in law enforcement. As the months stretched into years, the nightmare that consumed the Midwest refused to fade. The terror had become part of the daily fabric, woven into the smallest routines and the deepest collective psyche of every community scarred by the Midwestern Ripper's string of violence. But time, instead of healing, only sharpened the memory of fear. With each new headline about another victim, sometimes a college student from Urbana, other times a state office worker, the sense of vulnerability became permanent. Nobody felt immune. Not the young, not the old, not even prominent citizens who once believed their social standing would shield them. What stung most for survivors and grieving families wasn't only the brutality of the crimes, but the mounting evidence that local law enforcement had mishandled crucial moments at every step. Retrospectives and angry editorials would later piece together the tangled timeline of missed opportunities, ignored warnings, and bureaucratic confusion that let a relentless predator roam free for so long. The mistakes that came to light weren't small blunders. They were fundamental failures that amplified the killer's reach and left dozens of additional lives in peril. In the first year alone, information routinely slipped through the cracks. When a university sophomore was attacked near the Urbana campus, her case file wound up in a stack marked non-urgent because the detective in charge was on vacation. It took nearly a month before her testimony, a nervous, trembling recollection of a black car circling the neighborhood, was ever reviewed. By then, the same vehicle had reportedly been spotted near 2 more crime scenes. The failure to create a centralized system for correlating such reports meant that crucial clues languished in isolation, unexamined. Similarly, composite sketches often sat in drawers rather than being shared to neighboring precincts. When an office worker was assaulted while walking to her car after a late shift, witnesses described a scruffy man lurking nearby, but the only drawing made by police didn't resemble the main suspect at all, and was never circulated publicly. Perhaps the most glaring errors involved mishandling of physical evidence. In Springfield, investigators recovered a torn piece of dark fabric clutched in a victim's hand, a potential tie to the suspect's coat or glove. But through a mix of inexperience and sheer bad luck, the sample was misplaced amid a lab move, never to be found again. Meanwhile, in Peoria, officers were seen trampling portions of a muddy crime scene while comforting a distraught neighbor, all but erasing a crucial tire tread in the process. Even seemingly routine details were overlooked. Logbooks noting suspicious vehicles or late-night noises vanished as shifts changed, or were ignored by superiors overwhelmed by the chaos. The mistakes extended beyond the evidence itself. Some detectives, frustrated by the mounting pressure, latched onto the wrong suspects, arresting janitors who worked nights, drifters who passed through town, or even local mechanics who fit the suspect's vague outline. The press, desperate for answers, sometimes published unverified tips, turning communities into rumor mills and sending police on wild goose chases. On more than one occasion, innocent people's reputations, livelihoods, and sense of safety were ruined because of hastily leaked names or misleading mugshots. Victims' families bore the brunt of these failures. The mother of an Urbana student who had pleaded with police to investigate a series of threatening phone calls weeks before her daughter's murder became an outspoken critic of the department. Her accusations, echoed by others as more patterns of negligence surfaced, forced internal reviews but seldom delivered real accountability. Community meetings grew heated, with residents demanding to know why so many promising leads had been ignored. Churches and schools organized petition drives calling for task force reform, urging outside agencies and even federal investigators to take command before more lives were lost to official incompetence. As these revelations bubbled to the surface, the sense of helplessness only deepened. For many in the heartland, the real horror shifted from the specter of an anonymous killer to the creeping realization that their safety depended on a system that seemed just as unpredictable as the violence itself. People began second-guessing police reassurances, relying more on their own neighborhood watches and private detective services. Some parents, remembering how earlier assurances proved meaningless, flatly refused to let their children out at dusk. All the while, survivors of attacks watched the slow churn of official confusion in bitter frustration. Some recounted how detectives dismissed their detailed statements as exaggerations at first. Others tried in vain to push for more attention to threatening patterns, particular makes of cars seen idling, out-of-state license plates, repeat sightings near bus stops, all swept aside amid the backlog of other tips. To this day, survivors remember the feeling that their trauma was being lost in paperwork, or worse, being replayed with each new police mistake. Perhaps the most tragic consequence was the sense that trust itself had been irrevocably damaged. Even when the police finally established a multi-agency task force and began pooling intelligence, the effort felt years too late. Those missteps had not only allowed the killer to evade capture, they'd undermined the faith that holds communities together during times of crisis. Neighbors, once tight-knit, grew suspicious of anyone with an unfamiliar car or an odd schedule. People whispered that the police chief harbored personal grudges or covered up minor crimes that might have pointed toward the real monster. Cops themselves felt the growing divide. Seasoned officers retired early in disgust, while younger recruits faced public scorn. the legacy of these errors still lingers. In local history books and true crime retrospectives, the case of the Midwestern Ripper isn't just a record of human evil, but a cautionary tale of what can happen when institutions fail at their most important responsibility, protecting the vulnerable. For every detective who worked exhausting double shifts or lost sleep over missed leads, there are still survivors and families determined to speak out, demanding transparency and reforms that might spare the next generation from similar heartbreak. And for the countless people who grew up in the Midwest during those long, haunted years, the lesson is clear. Sometimes the wounds that last the longest aren't the ones a killer leaves behind, but those exposed by the faltering hands of authority meant to keep the darkness at bay. Turning point, the accused culprit is exposed and then set free. In a case that had already seen its share of heartbreak, confusion, and relentless fear, the year 1978 brought a surprising new chapter, the moment when everything seemed to hinge on a single suspect. By this point, the collective fatigue of police, journalists, and community members had congealed into a kind of numbness, the desperate hope for a break competing against the now ingrained expectation of more dead ends. Still, when the name William Scott surfaced in the investigation, every heart in the region skipped a beat. William Scott was not just any suspect. A 31-year-old long-haul trucker based in Bloomington, Illinois, William cut a striking figure. Tall, bearded, with the world-weary look of someone used to endless miles alone on American highways. What first put him on investigators' radar was a cluster of overlapping details. His semi-truck had been spotted near 2 crime scenes, he drove frequent night routes matching the timeline of several attacks, and perhaps most chillingly, his appearance matched survivor composite sketches better than anyone previously questioned. Even more, his reputation in several red-light districts was the source of whispers. Late-night loitering, odd exchanges with transient workers, a barely contained temper when questioned by bar staff or motel clerks. Detectives believed at last that they had found the man responsible for the relentless terror. The evidence was circumstantial but felt compelling, a pattern of proximity to the crimes, multiple witness statements placing his truck at rest stops and alleys adjacent to incident sites, and a lingering sense of unease stoked by the way he moved in and out of towns almost at random. After a tip from a nervous motel manager who remembered a small cut on Scott's hand after one attack, the police formally brought him in for questioning. The region held its breath. This was the first time a real, flesh-and-blood suspect had been so thoroughly investigated in the public eye. Scott's mugshot was leaked to local papers, prompting a flurry of hopeful headlines. Serial killer finally caught? For nearly 48 hours, investigators grilled William. He maintained an unnerving calm throughout, never breaking under pressure, never contradicting himself. At first, police matched the evidence with surprising precision. Tire treads on his truck looked similar to those photographed at one of the scenes, and the distinctive mud flaps matched bystanders' descriptions. More damning, a dark jacket in his cab had a torn cuff, echoing scraps of fabric found in a victim's hand from a Springfield attack. It was nearly enough for an arrest, and the task force was ready to announce victory to the press. But then, like so many times before, the promising thread began to unravel. William Scott's wife, a nursing assistant named Linda, emerged with a meticulously kept calendar, stacks of pay stubs, and letters proving Scott had been in Decatur Hospital on 2 crucial nights during key attacks. Several hospital employees, nurse supervisors, janitors with no connection to Scott, confirmed that William was in the waiting room or visiting Linda during the hours the crimes occurred. Phone records showed multiple calls backing this up, and receipts from a greasy diner in Bloomington placed him miles away from at least one victim at the time of her assault. For forensic teams still hoping for a magic bullet, the evidence was a crushing letdown. The scrap of jacket fabric, once hailed as a breakthrough, was judged inconclusive after lab analysis, too generic to fully tie to Scott's clothing. The investigation, so recently electrified, ground to an agonizing halt. Some detectives resisted letting go, convinced Scott might have had help or altered records. But in the end, none of the evidence was enough to hold him. Under pressure from attorneys and civil liberties organizations, authorities had no option but to let Scott walk free. The public outcry was immediate and deafening. News stations ran loops of Scott leaving the police station, shielding his face from cameras, while residents vented their frustration and fear on talk radio shows and in angry letters to the editor. For families of victims and survivors, this was a cruel joke, another example of a system that could not protect or deliver justice. Rumors and paranoia soared, with many locals refusing to believe Scott's innocence. Some insisted the alibi was a setup, that his wife had lied or manufactured evidence. Others began to despair, convinced the killer was now emboldened to strike again given how narrowly he had escaped. Investigators struggled to contain the backlash. Their focus and their credibility were both under siege. The ordeal left its own trail of chaos beyond the immediate investigation. William Scott's life unraveled in public. Despite his legal exoneration, his name became synonymous with suspicion. He lost his job after clients complained about his presence in truck stops, his marriage strained under the stigma and fear. Angry neighbors harassed his family, spray-painting slurs on their driveway and anonymously reporting him to Child Protective Services. The myth of the escaped killer proved even harder to shake than the reality of his innocence. Meanwhile, police were forced into uncomfortable self-reflection. The case became a study in the dangers of tunnel vision, of matching a suspect to a narrative rather than the facts, and of how desperate desire for a break can outpace the slow work of real justice. It also reshaped investigative protocol. Agencies, under mounting criticism, began to share information more systematically, vet evidence with greater skepticism, and institute checks to avoid rushing to judgment in high-pressure cases. The William Scott episode prompted new training for officers, with emphasis on corroborating every detail before publicizing a suspect, a process that would shift how serial crimes were investigated throughout Illinois and beyond. Underlying all of this was an even deeper wound for the community. Confidence in police plummeted, public trust took years to mend, if it ever truly recovered. Some survivors wondered aloud if anyone would ever answer for their trauma. For the detectives who remained on the case, the failure to hold on to Scott and the backlash from the public haunted their every step. They pressed on, determined not to let the brief taste of hope or the bitterness of its loss define their legacy. But the scars would remain, visible in local newspapers, whispered in corner booths, or scrawled in letters to future investigators, the moment when it felt like the monster could have finally been stopped, but slipped once more through the cracks. Net of confessions, a chilling testimony, and the price of subjectivity. The autumn of 1981 brought with it a sense of change and foreboding. Years of fear, frustration, and unanswered questions had worn down both the community and the task force chasing their elusive killer. It was during one of these nondescript October nights near Joliet that fate at last tipped the scales. A routine roadside checkpoint, set up mainly to catch drunk drivers on a stretch of state highway that locals dubbed the Gauntlet, turned out to be the setup for closure no one had dared hope for. William Scott had grown skilled at blending into the background, an everyman with weathered skin, tired eyes, and a semi-permanent scowl. His truck, battered but kept in just right working order, didn't look out of place among the nocturnal traffic of long-haul drivers passing through Illinois. What caught the cops' attention, almost by accident, was a minor discrepancy, faded, mismatched license plates that didn't quite align with state records. It was that little oddity, a stroke of law enforcement luck, that would forever change the narrative of the Midwestern Ripper. The moment the officers initiated the stop, they noted Scott's tenseness and the faint whiff of sweat mixed with oil and diesel. His answers to their basic questions about his destination, his cargo, were halting, inconsistent, enough to justify a closer look. While one officer ran the plates again, the other peered into the cab's shadowy interior and caught sight of a heavy hammer and a blade-shaped tool tucked below the passenger seat, both smeared with what looked alarmingly like dried blood. A quick search and procedure turned to panic. Blood-stained fabrics, gloves, and ominously heavy plastic bags lay hidden behind the seats. There was no mistaking the gravity. This was no ordinary smuggler or thief. The discovery led to a quiet, tense arrest on the spot, Scott facing down the deputies with an expression as blank as winter concrete. That night the news began to break. Whispers grew into frantic phone calls. Could it really be him? Was the monster finally under lock and key? The interrogation that followed became the stuff of legend among both journalists and law enforcement circles. Days without sunlight, Scott simply sat and stared, his gaze flickering over each detective as if calculating which detail of his story to reveal or bury. The case against him grew rapidly. The gloves, the hammer, the blade, all matched previous forensic evidence, including blood and fiber samples. But it was his confession, the cold, methodical way he recounted years of violence, that left even seasoned investigators deeply unsettled. Scott's motives, laid bare in his flat, unemotional monologue, felt like daggers aimed straight at the heart of any sense of safety. He spoke of an all-consuming rage towards women, seated in a childhood marked by a violent, philandering mother and a parade of cruel stepfathers. As a young man, he buried his loneliness in a string of dead-end jobs, first as a gravedigger, a detail that would haunt several detectives, then drifting to trucking, where he discovered the anonymity and opportunity of the open road. He described, with chilling detachment, how killing became his ritual, a form of cleansing, as he termed it, against a world he viewed as corrupt and broken. Women, he claimed, became symbols of society's betrayal, and each attack was a way to exert control, to force his pain into the world with irreversible consequences. His stories were detailed, methodical, and sickeningly consistent with evidence from multiple crime scenes. He could recall in uncanny photographic memory the layout of alleys in Springfield or the sound a particular victim made as she attempted to scream but never could. On one occasion he confessed to deliberately leaving the groceries at Gina Miller's side, a final twisted show of dominance and mockery of the mundane routines he destroyed. The interviews with Scott included references to times when he was nearly caught, such as when residents of Peoria had spotted his truck and police had interviewed him following a helpful tip, but his wife's rapid, well-coordinated alibi had been enough to send the case back into limbo. It was these admissions, the times he seemed within reach and slipped away, sometimes thanks to police missteps, other times due to sheer luck, that stung the most in hindsight. Each recollection was a punch to the gut for officers and families, reminders of the heavy price paid for every moment of complacency or procedural error. As more evidence poured in to corroborate details of his confession, the scale of Scott's crimes became even bleaker. Over a dozen confirmed murders, a greater number of attempted murders, and dozens more cold cases began to take on a new, horrifying clarity. Survivors recognized him in police lineups. Family members of victims finally, through tears and outrage, had a name to attach to their grief and trauma. The aftermath stretched beyond filing charges and preparing for trial. It was a reckoning for law enforcement. The Macomb precinct captain's voice quaked during a press conference as he apologized to families for the slow pace of justice. Police unions called for new training and technology. Cities debated how best to heal wounds made by years of terror and the humiliation of repeated investigative failures. Newspaper editorials questioned the entire structure of police accountability. How could such a monster hide in plain sight for so long, despite the hundreds of pages of tips, sketches, and evidence? Even as William Scott awaited trial in a high-security cell, his lack of remorse unsettled everyone. On courtroom transcripts and in-person interviews, he answered questions bluntly, neither bragging nor apologizing. Asked if he felt regret, Scott famously shrugged and replied, "Regret is for those who plan on changing." It was this utter void of empathy, this absence of even self-pity, that unsettled not just authorities but an entire generation exposed to the depths of evil. Yet perhaps the heaviest price was not the years lost or the procedural blunders that helped Scott evade justice for so long. It was instead the evaporation of innocence, the realization that safety is fragile, that faith in the system could be so deeply violated, and that evil sometimes walks among us with a smile, hidden only by the thin veneer of ordinary life. For every investigator who sunk years into the manhunt, for every family who never again trusted the evening news or the midnight streets, the true cost was measured in stolen peace of mind and a generation's raw determination to never let vigilance or compassion fall victim to complacency again. Historic trial and criminal legacy. The trial of William Scott was not just a courtroom proceeding, it became one of the most closely watched legal spectacles in Midwest history. A showdown between a system grappling with its own failures and the horrifying embodiment of evil that had haunted its towns for years. Long before Scott entered the Chicago federal courthouse, the case had polarized public opinion, ignited sweeping changes in policing, and etched itself into the nightmares of multiple generations. From the moment he was arraigned, the atmosphere surrounding the trial was electric and fraught with tension. For months, the local press ran daily updates and background stories, retracing Scott's trail of terror across the state. The courthouse itself, an imposing centuries-old building with thick stone columns, was transformed into a heavily policed fortress. Metal detectors, newly installed, echoed as victims' families, local residents, reporters, and a dizzying spectrum of onlookers filed in each day, some clutching prayer books, others protest banners or yellowed newspaper clippings. The jury had been chosen carefully from hundreds of candidates, with prosecutors and defense alike probing for anyone touched personally by the violence or the subsequent torrent of fear. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney, renowned for her empathy and resolve, methodically presented an overwhelming body of evidence. Blood-stained tools found in Scott's truck, chillingly detailed confessions, physical proximity of Scott to multiple crime scenes thanks to trucking logs, and harrowing testimony from those who had survived his attacks. These moments in the courtroom were raw and painful. Survivors relived their terror under cross-examination, while grieving relatives of victims had to endure the cold recitation of autopsy reports and crime scene photos that punctuated every session. The visual power of the evidence was undeniable. The line between horror story and legal record blurred as the jury was shown the signature marks of Scott's crimes: deep gashes, crushed bones, items meticulously arranged over and over again. Scott himself was a study in contradiction. Wearing a plain suit, flanked by a public defender, he maintained an unsettling calm, offering restrained, almost clinical responses when called to testify. His account of events laid bare under direct and cross-examination was devoid of remorse. He described his actions as a ritual, and claimed his motivation was to cleanse the world of sin. The psychological experts called by the defense depicted a deeply disturbed individual scarred by years of childhood abuse and social alienation, but the prosecution countered with damning portraits of a predator who manipulated appearances and calculated his destruction with chilling precision. Experts debated whether he was legally insane or merely monstrous by choice. The conclusion the jury would reach would have implications far beyond this single trial. Outside the courthouse, Scott's capture and trial sent shockwaves through American law enforcement circles. His crimes, and the years spent in pursuit, spurred an unprecedented wave of reforms. Police at all levels overhauled protocols for evidence sharing and multi-agency cooperation. Psychological profiling, still in its early stages during Scott's spree, became crucial to major investigations. Lawmakers across several states passed Scott-inspired legislation mandating better tracking of transient workers and more rigorous background checks for commercial drivers. Survivors' advocacy groups were born out of the trial and its aftermath, pressing for changes in support services for crime victims and stricter community notification systems. For the first time in Illinois history, survivors and families addressed the court directly at sentencing, their voices shaping victim impact laws for decades to come. The 2-week trial culminated in a verdict that brought a complicated catharsis to the region. Scott was found guilty on all major counts: 13 murders, multiple counts of attempted murder, and aggravated assault. The judge, in a voice trembling with emotion, handed down 20 consecutive life sentences without parole, declaring that society can never risk your freedom again. The courtroom erupted, some sobbed with relief, while others gasped at the totality of what had been lost. There was no possibility of closure for many, but some solace in the knowledge that Scott would never walk free. Yet the legacy of the case stretched far beyond the life and sentencing of Scott alone. Community leaders launched annual memorials in honor of the victims. Crime documentaries, books, and investigative specials dissected the failures and lessons of the Midwestern Ripper case. Law enforcement training manuals across the nation cited the investigation as both inspiration for reform and a cautionary tale about the consequences of bureaucracy, delay, and complacency. The trial drove home how the ripples of violence extend through every layer of society, leaving scars not just on the victims and their families, but on public trust, community identity, and collective memory. In the years that followed, Illinois would never fully return to the innocence lost during those long, haunted years. Even as Scott died in prison during the COVID-19 pandemic, a quiet, almost anticlimactic end for a man who had cast such a long shadow, his name remained a warning. Parents told their children stories of the summer when darkness conquered daylight. Police walked their beats with new urgency. In memorial gardens where the names of the lost are carved in stone, towns gather each year to remember, reaffirming a promise to never again allow evil to flourish in silence or error. The trial was not simply the end of a killer's reign, it was the beginning of an era of reckoning, of painful remembrance and relentless vigilance, a legacy carved as much from heartbreak as from hope.